On the morning of March 15th, 44 BC, a man walked into a Senate meeting in Rome carrying a dagger under his toga. He was not a radical. He was not an outsider. He was one of the most respected senators in the Republic. He was a philosopher, a judge, a man so famously devoted to the principle that even his enemies did not question his sincerity. He was also the closest thing Julius Caesar had to a son. By midday, Caesar would be dead, 23 stab wounds. His body slumped at the base of a statue of his old rival Pompey, with his toga pulled over his face. And the man, philosopher, protege, and senator who had agonized for weeks over what he was about to do would be standing over the corpse with blood on his hands, having just committed the most famous political murder in the history of the Western world. His name was Marcus Junius Brutus, and 2,000 years later, we still cannot agree on what he was. Was Brutus a patriot who sacrificed everything to save a dying republic? Or was he an aristocrat who murdered a popular leader to protect the privileges of his class? This is the question at the center of today's episode, and I'm not going to answer it for you. I'm going to give you the evidence, both sides, and I'll let you decide for yourselves. This is Venerable Lives, the podcast where we cover the single defining moments that turned people into the figures history remembers. I'm your host, Thomas, and today we are going to follow Marcus Junius Brutus from the weight of an impossible name to the blade of a sword on a battlefield in Greece. We are going to look at the man from every angle, the idealist and the hypocrite, the liberator and the oligarch, and the son who loved his mentor and killed him anyway. This story is not simple, and anyone who tells you it is has already picked a side. To understand Brutus, you have to understand the family name. In 509 BC, nearly 4.5 centuries before our story, a man called Lucius Junius Brutus helped overthrow the last king of Rome. The king's son, Sextus Tarquinius, had raped a noblewoman named Lucretia, who chose to kill herself rather than live with the shame. Lucius Brutus led the uprising, expelled the royal family, and became one of the first 2 consuls of the new Roman Republic. Then, when his own sons were caught conspiring to restore the monarchy, he sat in the judgment and sentenced them to death. He watched the execution. He chose the republic over blood, principle over love. That is the founding story of the Roman Republic, and it was the founding story of the Brutus family. Every Roman child knew the story. Every senator invoked it when the Republic felt threatened, and for the family that bore the name, it was not just a story. It was a mission. The Bruti existed in the Roman imagination to stand between the Republic and anyone who tried to become king. So I ask you to think about what that does to a person. Growing up in a family where the most celebrated ancestor is the man who executed his own children for the sake of the state. What kind of moral pressure does that create? And at what point does inherited duty become a trap? Marcus Junius Brutus was born in 85 BC under this unimaginable weight. His father, also sharing the same name, was killed by Pompey when Brutus was still a child. He was murdered during a failed rebellion, a political casualty of the chaos that was devouring the late Republic. His mother was Servilia, who was one of the most formidable women in Rome. She was politically brilliant, socially ruthless, and for years the lover of Julius Caesar. The affair was common knowledge. It began before Brutus was born and continued on and off for decades. Some ancient sources even speculated that Brutus might have been Caesar's biological son. Most historians doubt it, but the rumor existed, and it colored everything that came after it. Young Brutus was raised largely by his uncle, Cato the Younger, and if you want to understand the man Brutus became, you need to understand Cato. Cato was the moral absolutist of the Roman Senate, a Stoic philosopher who lived his principles with a rigor that bordered on fanaticism. He refused bribes in an era when bribery was the operating system of Roman politics. He walked barefoot through the Senate to make a point about simplicity. He opposed Caesar not because he hated Caesar personally, but because he believed with every fiber of his being that no man should hold power over a free republic. He would eventually kill himself rather than accept Caesar's mercy after the Civil War, disemboweling himself with his own sword when doctors tried to save him. That was Brutus's uncle. That was his moral education. Brutus studied Greek philosophy and Latin rhetoric. He became a Stoic himself, deeply read, thoughtful, and admired by intellectuals across Rome. Cicero, the greatest orator of the age, considered Brutus a peer. He wrote treatises and corresponded with the leading minds of his era. By every measure of Roman aristocratic achievement, Brutus was a success. He was principled, educated, well-connected, and climbing the political ladder exactly as a man of his station was expected to. Then, Rome tore itself apart. In 49 BC, the long-simmering conflict between Caesar and the Senate exploded into a civil war. Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his legions. Pompey, the Senate's champion, rallied the old order to oppose him, and Brutus faced a choice that tells you everything about the kind of man he was, or at least the kind of man he wanted to be. Pompey had murdered his father. This was not metaphorical. Pompey had literally killed Brutus's father during the chaos of Lepidus's rebellion in 77 BC. Brutus had every personal reason to hate Pompey. But Caesar represented the populares, the faction that was dismantling senatorial power, and Pompey represented the republic as the Senate understood it. Brutus chose Pompey. He chose the cause over the grudge. He chose the republic over personal revenge, or, depending on how you read it, he chose his class over his heart. Pompey lost at Pharsalus in 48 BC. Brutus surrendered to Caesar. And here is where the relationship between these two men becomes almost unbearably poetic. Caesar did not punish Brutus. He did not even reproach him. He welcomed him back. He gave him a governorship in Cisalpine Gaul. He made him praetor urbanus in 44 BC, one of the highest judicial offices in Rome. Caesar's affection for Brutus was so well known that, according to Plutarch, when the Battle of Pharsalus was raging, Caesar gave explicit orders that Brutus was not to be harmed, and that if he surrendered, he was to be brought safely to Caesar. If he refused to surrender, he was to be left alone. In the middle of the civil war, Caesar was protecting the young man his enemies had sent to fight him. So, Caesar protected Brutus on the battlefield, forgave him, promoted him, trusted him, and Brutus repaid all of that with a knife wound. If you are making the case for Brutus the traitor, this is where you start. But if you are making the case for Brutus the patriot, this is exactly what makes the sacrifice meaningful. He did not kill a stranger. He killed a man who loved him. So far, we have a portrait of an almost impossibly noble man, a philosopher-politician carrying the moral weight of Rome's founding story. But here is where I need to complicate that picture, because the idealist had a shadow. You see, Brutus was a loan shark, as we might call him in the modern sense, and not a casual one at that. Through intermediaries, he loaned money to the city of Salamis on Cyprus at an annual interest rate of 48%. The legal limit in Rome was 12%. When the city could not pay, Brutus's agents, backed by Roman cavalry, besieged the local council. 5 city officials starved to death. This was not a rumor or a political smear. It was documented in the private correspondence of Cicero, who was horrified when he discovered that the supposedly virtuous Brutus was behind the loans. Brutus used fake names and obtained special Senate exemptions to circumvent the usury laws. The philosopher of public duty was in private a loan shark of extraordinary ruthlessness. Hold on that fact. We are going to need it later. Now, let us talk about Caesar, because to judge Brutus on what he did on the Ides of March, you need to see Caesar from both directions. The case for Caesar as a tyrant is rather straightforward, and it is the case the conspirators made. By early 44 BC, Caesar had been declared dictator perpetuo, or dictator in perpetuity. Dictatorships in Rome were supposed to be temporary, emergency appointments. Caesar's was forever. He put his own image on coins, a privilege previously reserved for the gods. He sat on a golden chair in the Senate. He wore the purple toga of triumph as everyday clothing. He appointed senators directly, bypassing elections. He expanded the Senate to 900 members, packing it with loyalists from Gaul and Spain, men who owed their positions entirely to him. And at the festival of Lupercalia in February of 44 BC, Mark Antony publicly offered Caesar a royal diadem, a crown. Caesar refused it, but not everyone was so convinced the refusal was genuine. Some believed it was a test of public opinion. Would the people of Rome accept a king? I mean, think about the theater of that moment. Antony climbs the podium in front of thousands of people and places a royal diadem on Caesar's head. There's a scattering of applause and silence from the rest. Caesar removes it, so Antony places it again. Then there's more silence. Caesar puts it aside and says Jupiter alone is king, and the crowd erupts. Now, was Caesar testing whether the people would accept a monarch, or was Antony acting on his own? Was it a carefully staged performance designed to let Caesar publicly refuse a crown he secretly wanted? Or was it exactly what it appeared to be? A loyal deputy making an offer, and a leader genuinely refusing? The sources disagree. Suetonius believes Caesar wanted to be king. Plutarch was less sure, and the conspirators were convinced it was a test. And that conviction helped push them over the edge. I find this is one of those places where the evidence cuts both ways. Caesar refused the crown. He said Jupiter alone was king in Rome. But he was also accumulating powers that looked an awful lot like a monarchy under a different name. So was the refusal sincere, or was it theater? We don't know. And neither did the people watching. You see, the case for Caesar as a reformer is equally powerful, and it is the case his defenders made. Caesar was, by any measure, the most effective advocate for the common people that Rome had produced in a generation. He canceled 1/4 of all outstanding debts. He gave handouts to the poor. He remitted a full year's rent for tenants in Rome. He redistributed public land to veterans. He founded colonies across the empire to resettle the urban poor, and he reformed the tax system. Caesar also spent enormous sums on public works to create employment. He extended Roman citizenship to communities in Gaul and Spain that the Senate had treated as conquered subjects. He was, in the language of Roman politics, a popularis, or a man of the people. So who was opposing him? The Senate. The same Senate that had, for a century, blocked every attempt at land reform, debt relief, and political inclusion. The same Senate whose members had grown obscenely wealthy from conquest, while peasant farmers who fought their wars lost their land. The same Senate that had murdered the Gracchi brothers for proposing redistribution, that had unleashed Sulla's proscriptions to protect aristocratic privilege, and that had fought every expansion of citizenship and every check on senatorial power with ruthless violence. The optimates, the conservative senatorial faction, had a track record, and it was not pretty. So, this is the question the conspirators did not want asked. If the republic they were trying to save was a system that worked primarily for a few hundred wealthy families, was it even worth saving? I mean, is it really still a republic if only the rich have a voice? That's why Brutus agonized. According to Plutarch, he barely slept in the weeks before the assassination. He could not eat. His wife Porcia, Cato's daughter, another layer of inherited obligation, had noticed the change and confronted him. To prove she could be trusted with his secret, she stabbed herself in the thigh with a knife and endured the wound without crying out. When she showed Brutus the gash, she asked him if she could bear this pain in silence. Could he not trust her with his burden? He told her everything. Even the decision to kill was a family affair. Anonymous notes began appearing on the statue of Lucius Junius Brutus in the Forum. Messages written by unknown hands. The city itself appeared to be calling him to act. Whether these were planted by Cassius and the conspirators or genuinely spontaneous, they worked. The weight of the name, the weight of the bloodline, the weight of his uncle's suicide and his ancestor's legend, it all pressed down on a single question. Would this Brutus do what a Brutus was supposed to do? Brutus, Cassius, and other liberatores framed the assassination as tyrannicide, the ancient and honorable act of killing a tyrant to preserve freedom. And they had a philosophical framework for it. Cicero had written extensively about the right, or duty, to destroy a tyrant. Brutus's own ancestor had established the precedent. In their telling, they were not murderers. They were the immune system of the republic, doing what a political body could not do for itself. But there's another way to read the Ides of March. Caesar was not killed by the people he oppressed, but by the people whose power he threatened. The 60 conspirators were almost exclusively senators and aristocrats. The men holding the daggers were the same men who had the most to lose from Caesar's reforms, the debt cancellations that cut into their lending profits, the land distribution that diminished their estates, and the expansion of citizenship that diluted their monopoly on political power. The men who killed the populists were the oligarchs. And Brutus, the philosopher of republican virtue. Remember, he was lending money at 4 times the legal interest rate and using soldiers to collect. The man who claimed to be saving the republic from a tyrant was personally profiting from the system the tyrant was trying to reform. You can hold that contradiction in your head, or you can resolve it, but you cannot ignore it. The assassination itself unfolded in the Curia of Pompey, a meeting hall within Pompey's theater. Caesar arrived late on the morning of March 15th. His wife, Calpurnia, had begged him to stay home. She had dreamed of his death. A soothsayer had warned him to beware of the Ides of March. But Decimus Brutus, a different Brutus, a co-conspirator, went to his house and convinced him that the Senate was waiting, and that it would look weak to stay home because of the woman's dream. As Caesar took his seat, a senator named Lucius Tullius Cimber approached with a petition to recall his exiled brother. When Caesar waved him away, Cimber grabbed his toga and pulled it from his shoulder. This was the signal. The daggers appeared. Caesar fought back at first, thrashing against the blows. Ancient sources generally agreed on what happened next. He resisted until he saw Brutus among the attackers. Then he stopped. According to several accounts, he spoke in Greek, not Latin, and he said, "You too, child." Or as Shakespeare put it, et tu, Brute. He pulled his toga over his face and collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue. 23 wounds. The physicians who later examined the body concluded that only one had been fatal. Brutus reportedly tried to address the Senate immediately after the killing to explain and frame the act in the language of liberation. But the senators had already fled. The conspirators walked through the streets of Rome holding their bloody daggers aloft, shouting that the tyrant was dead and that the republic was free. The people of Rome stared at them in silence. What followed was a masterpiece of political destruction, and Brutus walked right into it. Mark Antony, Caesar's co-consul, his loyal lieutenant, had negotiated an initial amnesty with the conspirators. The Senate pardoned the assassins and ratified Caesar's appointments. For a few days, it looked like the Republic might actually absorb the shock. But then came the funeral. Antony delivered his oration over Caesar's body in the Forum. The historical Antony was not Shakespeare's Antony, but the effect was the same. He read Caesar's will aloud. Caesar had left his private gardens to the people of Rome as a public park, and 75 denarii to every Roman citizen. Antony displayed the blood-stained toga. He listed Caesar's reform, the debt relief, the land grants, and the public works. The crowd's grief turned to fury. They tore apart the coffin stand to build a pyre in the Forum and cremated the body on the spot. Armed mobs surged through the streets hunting the conspirators. The liberatores fled Rome, and they would never return. So I'm not going to tell you what to think here. I'm laying out the evidence. But notice this. The people who killed Caesar called themselves liberatores, or the liberators. They minted coins celebrating the act, and yet, when Caesar's body was displayed to the public, the people of Rome rioted against the assassins, not against the so-called tyrant. So who was being liberated, and from what? Did Brutus really believe the people would thank him? He had just killed their champion and expected gratitude. Think about the disconnect. Either Brutus was profoundly out of touch with the people he claimed to represent, or the people he was actually representing were not the common citizens of Rome. Brutus spent the next 2 years in the eastern provinces, raising armies, collecting taxes, and, in an irony that should not be overlooked, as just mentioned, minting coins with his own portrait on them. One design became infamous, the Ides of March denarius, showing 2 daggers flanking a cap of liberty, with the inscription Ides of March, or the Ides of March. Brutus was advertising the assassination. He was branding it. He was proud. The same man who had killed Caesar for putting his face on coins was now putting his own face on coins and celebrating the murder. He squeezed gold from the cities of Asia Minor with an efficiency any warlord would have envied. He demanded tribute. He levied troops. The philosopher-senator had become, by necessity or by nature, a military strongman ruling the eastern Mediterranean. The end came at Philippi. In October 42 BC, on the plains of northern Greece, Brutus and Cassius met the armies of Mark Antony and Caesar's adopted heir, the young Octavian. There were 2 battles. In the first, Brutus's forces actually won their engagement and overran Octavian's camp, but Cassius, on the other wing, was defeated, and believing the battle was lost entirely, Cassius took his own life. According to Plutarch, in the weeks before the battle, Brutus had seen a ghost. A terrible figure appeared in his tent at night, and when Brutus asked who it was, the specter answered, "The evil genius, Brutus. You will see me at Philippi." Whether this is history or literary invention, it captures something true about the psychological weight Brutus was carrying. He had killed the man who loved him the most. He had gambled everything on the idea that the act would save the Republic, and now he was watching the Republic die anyway, in his own camp, and under his own command. The second battle was a rout. Brutus's lines collapsed. He fled the field with a small group of companions, knowing capture meant a spectacle, a triumphant parade through Rome, and the humiliation of the last liberator. He chose the same exit his uncle Cato had chosen. He ran on his sword. Among his last words, according to Plutarch, was a line from Euripides: "O wretched virtue, you are but a name, and yet I worshipped you as real. But now it seems you were fortune's slave." Marcus Junius Brutus was only 43 years old. So his last words were a curse on virtue itself. After a lifetime devoted to principle, in his final moment, Brutus concluded that virtue was an illusion, a slave to fortune. Or did he? Was this despair? Was it clarity? Was it the cry of a man who finally understood that good intentions are not good enough? Antony reportedly found his body and covered it with his own purple cloak as a mark of respect. Years later, Octavian, now Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, would visit the statue of Lucius Junius Brutus and declare that the man who had killed kings was a true Roman. The family name still carried power, even for the man who had built the very monarchy the Bruti had existed to prevent. So, let me lay the two arguments side by side one final time, and then I am going to leave them with you. The case for Brutus the hero was that he was a man of genuine principle who saw the dictator accumulating permanent, unchecked power in a system designed to prevent exactly that. His family had founded the Republic. His uncle had died for it. His philosophical training told him that tyrannicide was not merely permitted, but required. He acted against his own personal interests. Caesar had been his mentor, his protector, and perhaps the closest thing to a father he had ever known. But he believed the Republic was more important than any relationship. He sacrificed everything: his safety, his friendships, and ultimately his life. Shakespeare was not wrong to call him the noblest Roman of all. Then we have the case for Brutus the oligarch. He was a wealthy aristocrat who murdered a popular reformer to preserve a political system that enriched his class at the expense of everyone else. The republic he was saving was an oligarchy in which a few hundred families monopolized land, wealth, and political power, while veterans starved and the urban poor lived in squalor. Caesar was the most effective champion the common people had. The men who killed him were the men who stood to lose the most from his reforms. Brutus himself was a usurer who lent money at 4 times the legal rate and let people die when they could not pay. Dante was not wrong when he put him in Satan's mouth. So, which Brutus is the real one, the idealist or the hypocrite, the liberator or the loan shark? Here is the uncomfortable truth. They might both be real. People contain contradictions. A man can believe in justice and profit from injustice at the same time. The question is not whether Brutus was good or bad. The question is what we do with people who are both. This is what we know for certain. The assassination did not save the Republic. Within 15 years, Caesar's adopted son Octavian would become Augustus, and Rome would have an emperor, the very thing Brutus killed to prevent. The Republic was already dying before the Ides of March. It had been dying for a century, eaten from within by inequality, corruption, civil war, and the inability of a system designed for a city-state to govern an empire. Brutus did not kill the disease. He killed the doctor, or he killed the tyrant. It depends on which story you want to believe. There is one more thing worth noticing, and I think it matters more than any verdict we could render. After the murder, after the mobs, after the flight from Rome and the wars and the ghost in the tent, at the very end, on a battlefield in Greece, with a sword in his hand and the Republic dying around him, Brutus cursed virtue. The man who had built his entire identity on doing the right thing died, believing that the right thing was meaningless. Maybe that is the lesson. Not whether Brutus was right or wrong, but what it costs to act on principle in a world that does not reward it. He gave up everything: his mentor, his career, his city, and his life for an idea, and the idea lost. The Republic fell, the emperors came, and the last thing Brutus said before he died was that virtue was a slave to fortune. So was he right about that? I don't know. That was Marcus Junius Brutus. I'm your host, Thomas, and this has been Venerable Lives. If this episode made you question how perspective can affect your opinion on historical events, or how much your values would truly mean facing an impossible choice, I ask you to leave a comment below. Share this episode with somebody who would enjoy it, and follow Venerable Lives on all podcast platforms. We have a newsletter and social media links available at venerablelives.com, where you can get a preview of upcoming historical figures and others we don't have the resources to cover on this show quite yet. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.